Hello guys, welcome back to our anime moments. Guys, please like the video and subscribe to my channel. Today is explanation of upcoming episode of Soul Land 2 Part 219 based on novel. So let's start. Personally, his aim was to become a member of the God Realm. But what about the Dolor continent? Would the Sun Moon Empire really conquer everything and rename it the Sun Moon continent? No, absolutely not. The Dolor continent will be the Dolor continent, and I am part of the Dolor continent. I cannot let that happen no matter what price I have to pay. Hui Yuhao took a deep breath as his thoughts stopped there. He gathered his mind once more, and his spiritual power transformed into countless tentacles as they stretched across the ground in all directions. Of course, he wasn't lying here to rest. He was waiting, and he was hoping that the Sun Moon Empire's main forces would appear. Heavenly Sea City was the Sun Moon Empire's most important coastal city in the south. Furthermore, this place was very far from Radiant City. Once the Sun Moon Empire's main forces appeared, the next part of his plan could continue. If his plan was successful in the end, he could see some hope for the Dolor continent. The thing that Hui Yuhao hoped for most was what the body Dolor had sacrificed himself to achieve, and that was to kill Xu Qianran. Xu Qianran was a ruthless and ambitious character, and Hui Yuhao still felt a little fearful towards him. He didn't know why he felt like that, but he was certain that the Sun Moon Empire would fall into disarray if he died. The Dolor continent could at least catch their breath if that happened. As for Zhu Zi, even though she was formidable commander, Hui Yuhao never treated her like an enemy in his heart for some reason. Hui Yuhao was aware of this problem. He knew that the reason why he couldn't become a commander of an army like Zhu Zi was because his heart was too soft. Eh? Hui Yuhao was still contemplating as he released his spiritual power, but a strange feeling suddenly appeared in his spiritual sea. This sensation was very unique. He realized to his shock that there were countless faint spiritual undulations within his spiritual detection's range. They were fearful and afraid. They were trying to dodge away, but couldn't run away at all. Every spiritual undulation was extremely fine and delicate, and a single thought from Hui Yuhao could destroy them. But this was the first time Hui Yuhao had felt so many instances of his spiritual power at the same time. This was his first experience after his spiritual power had completely entered a very detailed and intricate level. These faint spiritual tentacles didn't come from his enemies, or from a formidable individual. They came from the plants that were growing in the earth. These plants ranged from a small blade of blue-silver grass to a large tree that was several dozen meters tall. Every plant possessed its own spiritual power. Some were strong, while others were weak, but they were mostly weak and frail. They were evidently feeling frightened because they could feel Hui Yuhao's powerful spiritual power. That feeling was just too strange. Hui Yuhao discovered for the first time that plants had spiritual power, even the small blue-silver grass was no exception. That feeling was just too magical. Hui Yuhao subconsciously expressed his friendliness while he made his spiritual power gentler as he stretched it out even further. His friendliness was instantly returned. Those frightened and fearful spiritual tentacles immediately stopped trembling and conveyed excited and happy thoughts to Hui Yuhao. Their thoughts and minds were so simple. But Hui Yuhao's heart was still filled with happiness and satisfaction in this moment. A single spiritual tentacle didn't count for anything, but when thousands and millions of spiritual tentacles were conveying their happiness, how could you not be happy? Hui Yuhao was like that, and so he was happy and elated that the friendliness he had released was immediately returned. Furthermore, those strange spiritual tentacles were fusing with his spiritual power, to the point where his spiritual detection could vividly sense the intricate changes that were happening to these plants. That sensation was extremely strange and unique, like Hui Yuhao had become the leader of all the plants within 5 kilometers around him, and his minions and subordinates were reporting their feelings to him. The plant's spiritual tentacles amplified him, and Hui Yuhao was consuming less and less spiritual power from using spiritual detection. Furthermore, the more spiritual tentacles that returned his friendliness there were, the less spiritual power he consumed. That's so magical. Spiritual power can actually be used this way. Hui Yuhao finally understood how, during his previous encounter, so many aquatic soul beasts could be linked together. That was especially so for the merfolk's martial soul combination skills. The reason why they could complete their martial soul combination skill probably wasn't because their blood and descent were very similar, but because their spiritual power was extremely well connected. Hui Yuhao seemed to have grasped some of the spiritual world's profundities. He no longer held back as he pushed his spiritual detection outward as much as he could, and the benevolence in his heart increased continuously. He felt the feedback that those plants were giving him, and he expressed his love for them at the same time. Hui Yuhao's spiritual detection was unwittingly extended very far, and his spiritual power gradually reached its limit. But Hui Yuhao was completely stunned at this point. Yes, he was astonished. He realized to his intense shock that his spiritual power's range could reach more than 50,000 meters in diameter. Hui Yuhao's spiritual detection normally had a limit of 20,000 meters. That was already a stunning figure, but that figure now stood at 50,000 meters. Even though this diameter was calculated with his body at the center, and it couldn't be used in a single direction, he had already surpassed everything in history, and created another miracle. Hui Yuhao believed that not even ultimate Doluo could stretch their spiritual power across 50 kilometers. A diameter of 50,000 meters meant a diameter of 50 kilometers. What an extraordinarily vast area of effect! Not only was Heavenly Sea City within his senses, but several other cities were also within range of his senses as well. Furthermore, his spiritual detection worked differently this time. It didn't project everything into his mind three-dimensionally. After reaching 50,000 kilometers, everything in Hui Yuhao's vision came from the plants that were cooperating with him. He was viewing the world through their feelings and vision. But that was already sufficient. Even though spiritual detection like that wasn't as complete as his three-dimensional spiritual detection was, conducting investigations through those plants' spiritual undulations was a lot more discreet. What kind of spiritual detectors would conduct investigations against a plant's spiritual power? A plant's spiritual power was too weak, it was entirely negligible. Hui Yuhao had unwittingly discovered such a mystical ability. How could he not be happy? Furthermore, he could obtain some simple information from these plants. Even though that information wasn't much, it was direct and easy to understand. Hui Yuhao relaxed as he felt his spiritual power extend outwards. He was like the king of all the plants within his spiritual detection, and all the plants around him were reporting their thoughts and feelings to him. A plant's thoughts were very simple. If you expressed your benevolence to them, they would express their friendliness to you. Furthermore, Hui Yuhao's spiritual power was extremely strong. There were some plant-type soul beasts within his spiritual detection, but most plant-type soul beasts were extremely weak. Their subordination to Hui Yuhao was even more complete, because they could sense exactly how formidable his spiritual power was. Suddenly, a thought occurred to Hui Yuhao. He asked a question with his spiritual detection, and used his consciousness to reach all the plants within his spiritual power's range. What Hui Yuhao didn't expect was, after several minutes, a single consciousness that was responding to him appeared in his mind. He was so excited that he jumped to his feet from the thicket he was in. The question he had asked those plants was simple. Have you seen the blue-silver emperor? The king of the blue-silver grass? Plants understood each other best, and Hui Yuhao only had a tiny shred of hope that his question would be answered. But he received a very definite reply after a few short minutes. Yes, he received a definite reply. Tang Yue's body was still very weak and frail. Even though ingesting the Qiankuan fortune pill meant she was no longer deteriorating towards death, her abilities were completely gone. She even needed to lean on something for support when she walked. How could Hui Yuhao be willing to see her like that? He never expected that the Blue-Silver Emperor, which he had tried so hard to find within the Doluo continent's 3 native empires to no avail, would be discovered in the Sun-Moon Empire. This was truly an unexpected surprise. Hui Yuhao regulated his breathing and tried his best to stabilize his emotions. Afterwards, he expressed benevolence towards that spiritual undulation that was giving him a definite reply, and concentrated his spiritual detection in that direction to search for the living being that was answering him. Hui Yuhao was very calm. He knew that he had to be very careful. He knew from how sensitive the plant's spiritual tentacles were that if overly eager emotions appeared in his spiritual undulations, he could very easily be removed from his current state. Establishing a connection once more would probably be extremely difficult. Gentle spiritual undulations that were filled with friendliness traveled soundlessly towards that living being that was giving him a definite reply. Hui Yuhao quickly discovered that plant, which had conspicuously stronger spiritual undulations than typical plants. When his spiritual power locked onto it, he realized to his surprise that it was a datura flower. This flower was no longer just a flower. It was a soul beast, and its cultivation rank was close to a 10-year soul beast. Its intelligence was just starting to open up, and there was a single thread of it. It was like an infant which had just been born for a little while, and it only possessed but a few basic and blurry instincts. Plant-type soul beasts' intelligence was activated more slowly than animal soul beasts. They could only be considered intelligent after they had 100,000 years of cultivation. Hui Yuhao didn't go near, because he was afraid that he would startle this large flower. He was a human after all, and soul beasts were very sensitive towards humans. Hui Yuhao's benevolent spiritual power circled over as he conveyed his emotions to that datura flower and inquired patiently. The datura flower told him that its pollen had sensed the blue-silver emperor at a valley not far from this place. Hui Yuhao's spiritual power could almost cover 50 kilometers. He quickly found that valley. He hadn't discovered anything different about that place, but under the datura flower's guidance, he immediately sensed how different the plants in this valley were from the outside world. Hui Yuhao's spiritual power could reach 50 kilometers in diameter because of these plants, but there weren't plants in every single corner within this range. He couldn't feel any spiritual tentacles in places where there were no plants, so he couldn't get their help from those areas. But when he inspected that valley closely, he noticed that there were many plants growing in this valley. However, not a single plant released their spiritual tentacles to merge with his. Seems like that must be the place. Hui Yuhao could feel himself getting excited. They had been searching for so long, and they had announced so many bounties over the past 2 years, while they had increased the rewards more than once. Even then, they couldn't find the blue-silver emperor at all. He hadn't expected to find a clue in this place. He was just about to stand up and proceed towards that valley to search when he sensed something, and lay back down in the thicket. He was using imitation, and he was just like a bush himself, as he didn't release any part of his aura at all. Hui Yuhao widened his eyes in surprise. Damn, the Sun-Moon Empire is worried after all. Beyond the horizon at the limits of his senses, Hui Yuhao could feel a large mass of aerial surveillance soul tools flying towards Heavenly Sea City. There were aerial surveillance soul tools both high in the sky and closer to the ground, and some were only 500 meters above the ground. He didn't use spiritual detection to detect them directly because they were too far away, so he could only observe them through the plants around them. Hui Yuhao noticed several dozen surveillance soul tools that were extremely close to the ground roaming around by observing everything, and many silhouettes surged high across the sky at the same time. Seems like my judgment is correct. The Sun-Moon Empire is concentrating their stronger forces to eradicate us. A faint smile appeared at the corner of Hui Yuhao's mouth. 2 pieces of good news had appeared one after another. How could he not be happy? He had to take a rain check for that valley, but the valley wasn't about to uproot itself and run away. He would execute his mission first before returning to search for the blue-silver emperor. Hui Yuhao was just lying there quietly, and it didn't take long before those lower surveillance soul tools reached his location and swept past him. Those surveillance soul tools that were responsible for surveillance lower to the ground contained thermal detectors, oscillation detectors, and even spiritual detectors. Even though there were relatively fewer spiritual detectors, there were enough to give Hui Yuhao a surprise. Has the Sun-Moon Empire really understood? Even if they haven't yet understood, they must have considered problems in that respect, and they've increased their spiritual detection capabilities. How lucky! Those spiritual detectors swept across Hui Yuhao, but didn't react at all. Their spiritual undulations didn't discover anything out of the ordinary. Of course, Hui Yuhao wouldn't give them a chance to discover anything. His spiritual aura had become identical to the plants around him, like he was completely assimilated into the thicket. Hui Yuhao also regulated his body temperature to be identical to everything around him, and his soul power was completely shut off. In addition to imitation, He was just like a shrub. Spiritual detectors wouldn't detect his presence even if they were just a foot in front of him as long as he didn't move. Those lower surveillance soul tools quickly flew by, and the aerial surveillance soul tools appeared immediately afterwards. Hui Yuhao didn't have to use spiritual detection to conduct a deep investigation. He could use his own spirit eyes to see those aerial surveillance soul tools very clearly. It didn't take long before he witnessed hundreds of aerial surveillance soul tools whiz by in the sky above him. They were dispersed as they flew in all directions, and all kinds of surveillance waves covered a tremendous surface area as they were like an enormous web that blanketed everything around Heavenly Sea City. A faint smile appeared on Hui Yuhao's face. "Go search. You'll never find us." Hui Yuhao's eyes suddenly froze in this moment. Shadows formed neat lines roughly 1,000 meters in the sky as they flew rapidly in Heavenly Sea City's direction. Dark golden colors flickered on their bodies, and they were still relatively conspicuous as the sun shone on them. Their silhouettes would become especially blurry during nighttime, and the light around them contorted faintly. Hui Yuhao drew a cold breath at what he saw. A single term appeared in his mind: human-shaped soul tools. Has the Sun Moon Empire really developed human-shaped soul tools? Yes, those dark golden shadows were soul engineers who were all covered in dark golden armor. How could Hui Yuhao not tell if that armor was just normal armor or human-shaped soul tools? Yes, those were human-shaped soul tools. Every single human-shaped soul tool was about 3 meters tall, and they were completely covered in dark golden armor. There were 3 pairs of flying-type soul tools outstretched behind their backs as they raced through the air. There were 300 people. 300 people raced above him in an instant, and every single person emanated frightening auras. The location of the eyes on their helmets radiated faint red colors. Light bent around them, and they seemed to assimilate into the air around them. Except, they were in the sky, and they didn't seem like they could find anything to integrate into. Hui Yuhao swallowed some saliva. What he was most worried about had happened after all. The Sun Moon Empire had finally made a breakthrough in their research into human-shaped soul tools, and their development seemed extremely strong. According to his investigations, the strongest legion in the Sun Moon Empire's hand that protects the nation was the Sun Moon Imperial Soul Engineering Legion, and they were formed from 300 soul engineers who were at least soul kings. But when these soul engineers flew over him, how could soul kings compare with their soul power undulations? Not even soul sages could match up to the strength of those soul power undulations. They clearly belonged to Soul Dolor, and that was especially so for the several dozen soul engineers who were flying at the forefront. Every single one had auras that were so deep and profound that they were undoubtedly titled Dolor. Hui Yuhao had always known that the Sun Moon Imperial Soul Engineer Legion was strong, but he didn't expect them to be that powerful. A Soul Engineer Legion like that could reach Heavenly Sea City from Radiant City in less than 4 hours if they flew with their full strength. They quickly flew over Hui Yuhao's head. Hui Yuhao stood up quietly, and took a deep breath as he gazed in the direction they were flying in. The Sun Moon Empire. This is the Sun Moon Empire's strength. Hui Yuhao pursed his lips tightly as he forced down the helplessness in his heart. He surged into the sky, and his Class 9 flying-type soul tool opened and activated at once. Boom! A dull boom could be heard as Hui Yuhao's body broke the sound barrier and raced in Radiant City's direction. Time! Time! What he needed most was time. He wanted Radiant City to feel alarmed and fearful, so time was most important for him. He had to complete his mission before the Sun Moon Imperial Soul Engineer Legion returned to Radiant City. It was already afternoon, and evening would come in 2 hours. Hui Yuhao could reach Radiant City before evening if everything went smoothly. The Imperial Soul Engineer Legion would take some time to search for them, and they would also need about 4 hours for their journey. It was likely that they couldn't return to Radiant City by tonight. And once he started operating inside Radiant City, he trusted that the Sun Moon Empire would find a way to inform the Imperial Soul Engineer Legion and seek their aid. From that moment onwards, he would only have 4 hours. What he could accomplish within those 4 hours was up to his own ability. Hui Yuhao was resilient and determined. After his initial shock from the Sun Moon Imperial Soul Engineer Legion's formidable equipment, he quickly calmed down as he tried to recall everything he had seen while he searched through the sky. The Sun-Moon Empire couldn't possibly have more than 300 Sol Dolor. That was impossible. Not even the Star Luo Empire, which had the most Soul Masters, had so many high-level Soul Masters. But the Imperial Soul Engineer Legion Soul Engineers had auras that were clearly no different from that of a Sol Dolor. This meant that the Soul Engineers' armor possessed excellent amplification effects, and they were probably Class 8 Soul tools. A single Class 8 Soul tool wasn't much, but what about 300 of them? What kind of power was that? The Sun-Moon Empire had enough power to fight the Holy Ghost Church with just this single Soul Engineer Legion. At least, they would have enough to intimidate and deter them from making any rash moves. But the Sun-Moon Empire didn't have what many 8-ringed individuals, so how were they using these Class 8 Soul tools? This was a doubt that Hui Yuhao couldn't wrap his head around. Using Soul tools which belonged to higher classes wasn't impossible under normal circumstances, but a single class was the limit. Soul tools with higher classes had more requirements and conditions, and they became increasingly harder for Soul Engineers of lower classes to use. Hui Yuhao was referring to normal Soul Masters. Graduates from Shrek Academy almost all possessed the ability to use Soul tools above their class, and that was due to their stable and consolidated foundations with their cultivation. But what about the Sun-Moon Empire? Most of their Soul Masters relied on medicine or certain auxiliary Soul tools to boost their Soul power. But what about their foundations? They probably didn't have any foundations, and everything was the result of undue haste. Many Soul Engineers found it difficult to improve further after obtaining 3 Soul Rings, not to mention using Soul tools above their current class. Only several 3-ringed Soul Engineers using a single Class 4 Soul tool could be successful. Under such circumstances, if the Imperial Soul Engineering Legion Soul Engineers were all Soul Kings, how could they cross 3 classes and use Class 8 Soul tools that only Soul Dolor could use? Even if the Sun-Moon Empire had some way to raise their cultivation to 6-ringed Soul Emperors, they still couldn't use Class 8 Soul tools. Boosting a Soul Master's cultivation beyond Soul Emperor using medicine was futile unless the medicines used were natural treasures. Normal medicine wouldn't be useful at all. Hui Yuhao didn't believe that the Sun-Moon Empire could forge something like the Qianquan Fortune Pill. If that was possible, Xu Qianran himself would probably have become an ultimate Dolor a long time ago. These doubts circled in Hui Yuhao's mind, and it was clear that he wouldn't find the answer. Unless he faced the Sun-Moon Imperial Soul Engineering Legion head-to-head, all he could do for now was speculate. Facing them head-to-head? Hui Yuhao laughed bitterly as that phrase occurred to him. How were they going to fight? 300 Soul Engineers who were at least Class 8 didn't even need linked Soul tools. If they gathered their fire, even the Death God Dolor, Yi Shishui, and the Dragon Emperor Dolor, Long Xiaoyao, would have to run away, not to mention himself. If they used linked Soul tools and locked onto their target, that destructive force could probably incinerate and vaporize an entire city in the blink of an eye. Such ultimate power hadn't been used on the battlefield yet. It wasn't hard to imagine the outcome if they appeared on the battlefield. Compared to this Soul Engineer Legion which was fully equipped with human-shaped Soul tools, the equipment of Shrek Academy's 3 Soul Engineer Legions was no different from that of a beggar. Hui Yuhao felt his heart sink when that thought occurred to him. His good mood because his plan was successful and because he had found the Blue-Silver Emperor's whereabouts vanished into thin air. Hui Yuhao wanted to maintain prolonged flight, so he kept his speed at the speed of sound. This was the only way that he could fly continuously while expending a lot of soul power. A Class 9 soul tool firing at full power could achieve an incredible speed. Hui Yuhao could see Radiant City far in front of him after a little over the hour. There were aerial and low-altitude surveillance soul tools in the skies above and around Radiant City. The Sun-Moon Empire had become even more wealthy after they conquered more than 2/3 of the Heavenly Soul Empire's territory. Over the past 2 years, they had probably used all the wealth and resources that they had obtained from the Heavenly Soul Empire on developing soul tools to reach where they were today. Hui Yuhao didn't fly directly into Radiant City. He didn't fully understand Radiant City's soul tools, and could even feel a tinge of fear from the bottom of his heart. He didn't know how advanced the Sun-Moon Empire had become with their soul tool technology. That was especially so when he witnessed their successful construction of human-shaped soul tools. Hui Yuhao descended to the ground when he was about 25 kilometers from Radiant City. He used imitation and hurried along, and he was a much smaller target on the ground. He used spiritual detection as far as he could to avoid any surveillance soul tools that could discover his traces. Radiant City was a city without walls, but that didn't mean it didn't have strong defenses. On the contrary, Radiant City possessed high-energy compression array soul tools, and the city's offensive and defensive capabilities were the absolute best on the continent. Hui Yuhao found an unassuming bush 5 kilometers from Radiant City and stopped. He lay down on the ground and replenished what he had consumed from flying at high speeds while attempting to extend his consciousness once more to feel the plant's spiritual undulations around him. Hui Yuhao quickly succeeded following his previous experiment. These plant situations were similar, especially so because Hui Yuhao directly released benevolent spiritual undulations and quickly attained their approval. Hui Yuhao's spiritual tentacles swiftly merged with those plant spiritual tentacles as he stretched them out into the distance. This was undoubtedly the safest surveillance method. Hui Yuhao risked being discovered by abilities like spiritual barriers if he used spiritual detection for surveillance, but extending his spiritual tentacles through those plants meant there was no way he could be discovered. Radiant City was a city like a forest of metal and steel. But even then, there were quite a few plants within it, and they were evenly distributed throughout the city. Hui Yuhao's spiritual power stretched out and quickly entered Radiant City. However, his spiritual power could stretch out with himself at the center when he connected with those plants, though he couldn't project his spiritual power in a single direction. Therefore, he could only reach 25 kilometers in Radiant City's direction. In addition to the 5 kilometers between Radiant City and himself, he could only reach 20 kilometers into Radiant City. 20 kilometers could cover typical cities several times over, but Radiant City was just too large. Hui Yuhao was 20 kilometers in, but he couldn't even reach half of Radiant City. But that was sufficient for now. Radiant City's aerial surveillance soul tools were mostly located around the city. But Hui Yuhao would be making a grave mistake if he thought this meant that they had fewer surveillance soul tools inside the city. The surveillance soul tools inside Radiant City were all on the ground, and they seamlessly covered every single corner. Radiant City lived up to its reputation after all. Large cities along the southern shores like Heavenly Sea City were a far cry from Radiant City. Hui Yuhao's first thought after his spiritual power reached its limit was that Radiant City was impregnable. Yes, Radiant City gave him a feeling that it was impregnable. That was just incredible. A city as large as that could give him a feeling that it was impregnable? That almost made him feel a little abnormal. This wasn't Hui Yuhao's first time at Radiant City, and every visit gave him different sensations. There was no doubt that Radiant City had changed a lot over the past 2 years, but one couldn't observe those changes simply by looking with his or her eyes. Only someone who could investigate and observe every inch of the city could discover the city's frightening hidden strength. Perhaps not even the Holy Ghost Church is aware. The corner of Hui Yuhao's mouth curved into a mocking smile. If the death god Doluo, Ishishui knew of the strength hidden within Radiant City, who knew how she would feel? Hui Yuhao couldn't reach the royal palace from his current position, but he tried his best to stretch his spiritual power ever further. He discovered something that piqued his interest, a high-energy compression array soul tool. Hui Yuhao was currently on Radiant City's southern side, and the high-energy compression array soul tool he had discovered was also on Radiant City's southern side. A patch of buildings and structures encircled this high-energy compression array soul tool, and there was also an enormous soul tool front deployed in the area. 150 soul engineers were responsible for guarding it, and Hui Yuhao could tell from this soul tool front scale that their offensive and defensive capabilities could probably cover half of Radiant City. Radiant City's 4 corners were probably arranged in similar fashion. Back when the body Dolor had launched a hysterical assault which he had paid for with his life, Xu Qianran had relied on the tremendous soul power stored within these high-energy compression array soul tools and unleashed the largest protective barrier in history to protect himself. Even though those defenses didn't allow him to completely dispel the body Dolor's attack, that was mostly because they were far too scattered. Hui Yuhao had witnessed how frightening high-energy compression array soul tools could be from that episode, and the soul power contained within such soul tools was just too vast. It wasn't hard to imagine the kind of explosive fighting strength that a single soul tool front could achieve by relying on even one such soul tool. For such high-energy compression soul tools were enough to make Radiant City impregnable. No, not 4. There must be more than 4. Hu Yuhao suddenly thought of how Radiant City's imperial palace suddenly became like a stronghold when it came under attack. That transformation could only be achieved with tremendous power, and it had to be supported by an equally vast power. This also meant that there was likely to be another high-energy compression array soul tool inside the imperial palace. Impressive, Sun Moon Empire. Radiant City could truly be described as impregnable with defenses like that. That was especially so if the Imperial Soul Engineer Legion was inside Radiant City. This meant that, in this world, only a god would probably have the strength to damage and destroy Radiant City. Hu Yuhao couldn't help but think about the god of emotions, Rong Nianbing. His strength was far from enough. At least, he didn't have enough strength to unleash the Morning Dew Dagger's full potential. Otherwise, how the Princess of the Sea force him into such a sorry position in the Ice Sea? Hu Yuhao circled around Radiant City for about a quarter of its circumference before he laid down in the vegetation and continued his investigation. Radiant City's circumstances were almost identical to his speculations, and there was a large soul tool front deployed on every side, each of which drew power from a high-energy compression array soul tool, while there were soul engineers operating it from within. Hu Yuhao discovered after several attempts that if he wanted to use his spiritual power to detect the plant's spiritual undulations, his body also had to be in contact with plants. For instance, he would have to lie down in blue-silver grass, or in a thicket. He could also lean against a tree trunk. If his body wasn't touching any plants, there was no way he could sense their spiritual undulations. This video will end here.